The day they put the handcuffs on me, my husband was standing in the doorway of our house watching. He didn't say anything. He didn't even move. He just stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the way he always looked when he'd already won an argument before it started. I remember thinking, not this can't be happening, not someone help me. I remember thinking he practiced that look. That was the moment I understood everything. My name is Vera. I'm 31 years old. I have a master's degree in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins, a patent with my name on it, and 18 months of my life that I will never get back. I want to tell you how it happened. Not because I need sympathy, I'm past that. I want to tell you because I spent years thinking I was careful. I thought I saw people clearly. I was wrong about one person, and that was enough to cost me almost everything. His name was Callister. We met when I was 26 at a conference in Chicago. He was charming in that quiet way, the kind of man who listens more than he talks and makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was a healthcare administrator. He knew the industry. He understood my work in a way most people didn't bother to. Within 6 months, I thought he was the person I'd been waiting for. I know now that he was studying me. I had founded a small clinical diagnostics company. I'll call it what it was, a startup I built with my own hands from a licensing deal on technology I'd developed during my postdoc. We had 8 employees, a lab in Baltimore, and a contract with 2 regional hospital networks. Nothing massive. But it was mine. Every dollar of seed funding, every regulatory filing, every late-night running tests, mine. When Callister and I got married, he suggested he could help manage the administrative side. I was stretched thin. The clinical work was demanding. The business side was swallowing hours I didn't have. He had the background. He knew compliance, contracts, vendor relationships. I told myself it made sense. I told myself it was partnership. My younger sister Bex was the only one who said anything. She sat across from me at our mom's kitchen table one Sunday and said, flat out, "Vera, don't give him access to the business. Keep it separate." I laughed. I told her she was being paranoid. She was 23 and had never been in a serious relationship, so what did she know? She knew. The first 2 years were fine. Better than fine, even. Callister was organized, efficient. The company grew. We landed a 3rd hospital contract. I hired 4 more people. I genuinely believed I'd found the right partner. What I didn't see was what he was doing in the margins. He was moving money. Not dramatically, not all at once. Small amounts, rerouted through vendor payments, adjusted in invoices, written off in categories I didn't audit closely because I trusted him. He was also building relationships I didn't know about with board members, with our primary hospital contact, with the compliance officers at our biggest account. He was making himself indispensable in all the places I wasn't paying attention. And then he found his opening. We had a diagnostic protocol in development, a rapid blood panel test for certain inflammatory markers. My design, my research, 2 years of internal validation. We were preparing for an expanded clinical trial at one of our hospital partners. Callister was the administrative liaison on the project. He changed the calibration parameters in the trial documentation. Not dramatically. Enough. 14 patients received results that affected their treatment decisions. 3 of them experienced complications directly linked to incorrect readings. One of them, a 64-year-old woman named Mrs. Albright, I've thought about her almost every day since, developed a condition that required hospitalization for 11 days before her doctors identified what had happened. The investigation came fast. It always does when patients are harmed. The documentation pointed to me. My name was on the protocol. The version Callister had submitted to the trial coordinator had been backdated and altered, but the metadata had been cleaned enough that the initial forensic review didn't catch it. What investigators found was a series of internal emails I had never written, sent from my account, suggesting I had approved the modified parameters to cut costs on the reagent supply. My account, my signature block, my company. I didn't know any of this until a federal investigator and 2 attorneys from the hospital's legal team were sitting in our conference room asking me to explain my own emails. I looked at those emails and I felt the floor go out from under me. Not because I didn't know they were false. I knew immediately the language wasn't mine, the reasoning wasn't mine. The cost-cutting logic described in those messages was exactly the kind of thing Callister cared about, and I never did. I felt the floor go out because I understood in that moment that someone had built this very carefully over a long time, and that someone was my husband. When I got home that night, I told him what had happened. I told him about the emails. I told him about the emails. I told him investigators were involved. He said, "I know. They contacted me this morning." He said it like he was telling me the weather. I looked at him and I said, "You did this." He looked back at me and said, "Vera, I think you need to get some rest. You've been under a lot of stress." That was the last real conversation we ever had. The licensing board suspended my credentials within 30 days. The hospital contracts were terminated. My 8 employees, people who had worked with me for years, people I had hired personally, had to be let go in a single afternoon. I stood in our lab and watched them pack their things, and I could not make myself speak. My attorney, a woman named Ms. Duvain, was honest with me from the start. She said the case looked bad on paper. She said the emails were sophisticated forgeries and that proving it would take time and resources. She said I should prepare myself. I said, "How much time?" She said, 18 months, maybe more. I did not cry. I remember making a deliberate choice not to. Not because I wasn't devastated. I was, but I had already started thinking, and I needed to keep thinking clearly. Callister filed for divorce 2 weeks after my suspension. He cited irreconcilable differences. He had a lawyer in place same day, which meant he had retained him before the investigation became public. He moved out of our house that same week, which meant he had somewhere to go. Both of those things told me he had been planning this exit for months. He was also filing to claim partial ownership of the company's intellectual property on the basis of his administrative contributions. He wanted the patent. He wanted the contracts, what was left of them. He wanted the lab equipment. He had documentation prepared for all of it. My sister came and stayed with me. She didn't say "I told you so." She just showed up with groceries and her laptop and sat at my kitchen table and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." Bex is a forensic accountant. I don't know if I've mentioned that. She works for a firm in DC that handles financial litigation. She's very good at her job. I told her everything. She said, "Okay, give me 30 days. I want to be honest about those 18 months. They were not a movie. There was no dramatic montage of me preparing my revenge with fierce determination. There were weeks where I barely got off the couch. There were nights I called Miss Duvain crying at 10 o'clock asking if there was any update. There were mornings I woke up and the first thought I had was the lab is gone, and the weight of that sat on my chest until I forced myself to stand up. I lost friends. Not all of them, but enough. Some people didn't know what to say. Some people quietly sided with Callister, who was still working in the industry, still moving in professional circles, telling a version of events that positioned me as unstable and reckless. He was good at that. He had years of practice managing impressions. What I had was time, and Bex, and Ms. Duvain, and eventually a forensic digital analyst named Mr. Chandra, who had 30 years of experience and the kind of patience for metadata that most people reserve for things they actually love. Mr. Chandra found the artifacts in the email headers that the initial investigation had missed, timestamps in the server logs that didn't match the send times in the email client, an IP address for 3 of the messages that traced back to a VPN service registered to a billing address that was not mine. It took him 4 months to build a report that could stand up in court. Bex found the money, all of it, or enough of it. 3 years of small diversions totaling just under $200,000. Not all of it traceable to Callister directly. He was careful, but enough to establish a pattern that contradicted his financial disclosures in the divorce proceedings. When combined with Mr. Chandra's findings, it also gave Ms. Duvain something she'd been waiting for: motive. It's a strange thing, motive. Investigators need it, juries respond to it, but the person who was betrayed usually understood the motive from the very beginning. I knew why he did it. He wanted the company, not to run it. He didn't have the technical knowledge. He wanted to sell it. The patent alone was worth something to the right buyer, and without me holding the controlling interest, he could negotiate a sale. The fraud case against me wasn't designed to destroy me. It was designed to remove me. He just didn't think I'd fight. The hearing before the licensing board was rescheduled 3 times. I want to tell you I was calm walking in. I was not calm. I wore a dark blazer and my hands were shaking inside my pockets, and I kept running the sequence of evidence in my head like I was afraid I'd forget it even though I wasn't the one presenting it. Miss Duvain presented it. 90 minutes. She walked the board through Mr. Chandra's analysis, through Bex's financial findings, through the divorce filing timeline and what it revealed about premeditation. She put the original trial documentation on the table alongside the altered version and walked through exactly where and how the parameters had been changed and what equipment would have been required to generate the kind of patient outcomes that followed. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She let the evidence speak. At one point during the hearing, the board chair asked a question about the IP address trace and whether there was any alternative explanation for the discrepancy. Mr. Chandra, who was present as an expert witness, said, "No, there is not." I sat in my chair and I watched the faces of the board members while he said it. Something shifted. I have been in enough rooms to know when a room shifts. When the board restored my credentials 3 weeks later, the letter arrived on a Thursday morning. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter in yesterday's clothes because I hadn't slept. I read it twice. I set it down. I called Bex. She said, "I know, I saw it come through on the portal. How do you feel?" I said, "I don't know yet." That was true. Vindication doesn't feel the way you think it will. It doesn't arrive like relief. It arrives more like exhaustion, finally getting permission to land. The civil case against Callister was filed the same week. Miss Duvain had been preparing it in parallel. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, intentional interference with business relations, and civil theft for the money Bex had traced. The intellectual property claim he had filed in the divorce was dismissed once the fraud findings were formalized. He retained 2 different attorneys before settling on a third. He made a counteroffer in mediation that Ms. Duvain described to me as optimistic. We declined. The settlement he agreed to, 6 months later, included full restitution of the diverted funds, a retraction filed with the hospital networks, and a clause I had specifically asked Ms. Spegg Duvain to include, a signed statement on record acknowledging that the alterations to the trial documentation were his. He signed it. He didn't want to go to trial. I'm told he has since moved to another city. I don't know what he's doing. I find that I don't care, which surprised me when I first noticed it. Mrs. Albright, the woman who was hospitalized. I wrote her a letter. My attorney advised me to route it through the settlement process. I did. In the letter, I told her that I was sorry for what happened to her. I told her that I had not been responsible for the error, but that she had been in my care and that her harm had mattered to me every day of the 18 months that followed. I told her that the person responsible had been held accountable and that I hoped the resolution brought her some peace. Her attorney wrote back on her behalf. The message was brief. It said she had read the letter, that she understood, and that she wished me well. I have read that message maybe 50 times. The company is not what it was. I won't pretend otherwise. We lost the original hospital contracts. The team I had built scattered during the suspension, starting over at 31 with a cleared name, but an interrupted record and a story that most people in the industry knew some version of. It's not the same as starting fresh, but I did start over. I brought Bex onto the board this time, formally, with a contract. We have an independent financial auditor and a legal compliance officer who reports to the board, not to me. Every major operational decision goes through a documented process. It's slower, it's more bureaucratic than I used to like. I sleep better than I have in years. My sister and I don't talk about what happened all the time. Sometimes we'll be sitting somewhere having coffee or driving somewhere, and one of us will say something small, a passing reference, and we'll both get quiet for a moment. She never says I told you so. She doesn't have to. There was a moment, maybe 6 weeks after the licensing decision came through, when I went back to Baltimore. I drove past the building where the lab used to be. Someone else's name is on the door now, a different kind of practice entirely. I sat in the car for a minute and looked at it. I thought about the version of myself who sat in that conference room and watched an investigator slide a stack of emails across the table. The one who looked at her husband's carefully assembled face in the doorway. The one who packed a single box of personal items out of a lab she had built from a postdoc fellowship and a patent and 4 years of 7-day weeks. I thought about what she did next. She called her sister. She found an attorney who would fight. She sat across from a forensic accountant and a digital analyst, and she answered every question, as many times as they asked, until the picture was complete enough to show a room full of people exactly what had happened. She did not beg. She did not collapse. She did not wait to be rescued. She prepared. And when the room finally shifted, when the board chair's face changed, when the settlement landed, when the letter arrived on a Thursday morning, she was still standing. That's the only thing I want you to take from this. Not that I'm strong, because I had days when I wasn't. Not that it worked out, because for 18 months I didn't know if it would. Just that preparation is the one thing no one can take from you while you're building it. I prepared, and in the end, that was enough. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in an abstract way, in a very practical, almost clinical way, the way you think about things when you've spent years working in science. Every outcome has a chain behind it. Every chain has a first link. Callister's first link was the decision to treat another person as a resource to be managed rather than a human being to be honest with. That's where it started. Not with the altered documentation, not with the forged emails, not with the retainer he had quietly paid before the investigation even went public. It started much earlier, the moment he looked at what I had built and decided it was something to take rather than something to contribute to. Everything that followed was just the shape that decision made as it moved through time. I'm not saying this to be harsh about him. I'm saying it because I think it's true, and I think it matters. There's a version of this story where I spend a lot of time talking about what he deserves, how satisfying it was to watch the settlement happen, how good it felt when the board restored my credentials. And some of that is real. I won't pretend the day that letter arrived didn't mean something to me. But the longer I sit with it, the more I realize that what I actually learned from this had less to do with him and more to do with me. I learned that intelligence without integrity is just a sharper tool for causing harm. Callister was smart. He was organized, methodical, patient. He used every one of those qualities to build something that was designed to hollow out another person's life. That's not strength. That's intelligence pointed in the wrong direction, and it will always, eventually, collapse under the weight of what it actually is. I learned that resilience isn't the absence of falling apart. I fell apart. I had weeks where I couldn't function. The difference between those weeks and giving up entirely was one thing. I kept asking what the next step was. Not the final step, not the step that would fix everything. Just the next one. Call Bex. Find Ms. Duvain. Answer Mr. Chandra's questions one more time. That's all resilience actually is. Not a feeling. A habit. And I learned, this one took the longest, that the most important thing I could have done differently was listen. Not to fear, not to suspicion for its own sake, but to the people who knew me well enough to see what I couldn't. Bex told me. She sat at our mother's kitchen table and told me plainly, and I dismissed her because I thought I knew better. I didn't know better. I just wanted things to be the way I wanted them to be, and I let that want override my judgment. That's not a character flaw I think I'll ever fully lose. I think most people who build things have some version of it, a tendency to see what we hope is there rather than what is. The work is learning to hold both at once, to stay open without being blind, to trust without outsourcing your own discernment. Vera, before all of this, had a company, a patent, and a husband she believed in. Vera, after, has something harder to name but more difficult to lose. She has a clearer picture of what she's actually capable of when everything external is stripped away. She has a sister on her board and a compliance process that would have stopped this before it started. She has, most importantly, a more honest relationship with her own blind spots. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not that bad things happen to good people, because that's true, but it's not useful. Not that patience wins in the end, because sometimes it doesn't. Just this. The most durable thing you can build is the version of yourself that knows what she's made of. Everything else can be rebuilt. That part, once you have it, no one can take it.